He called me a ditch digger with a hard hat, said it in front of 14 project managers, 2 field superintendents, and a scheduler who'd been with the company longer than Blake Mohouse had been alive. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. 30 years old, Georgetown MBA, wearing a carbon fiber hard hat that had never been underground, and Red Wing boots so clean you could eat off the soles. AirPods in his ears, at a project manager's meeting. On a Tuesday morning in an active construction office where men were running $1.3 billion in live tunnel contracts. Ditch digger. I let that sit for about 4 seconds. Then I picked up my thermos, stood up, and walked out of the room. He had no idea what he just did. My name is Mitch Saylor. I'm 56 years old. I spent 25 years in the United States Army, enlisted at 17 as a combat engineer, earned my commission through Green to Gold, and retired at 42 as a lieutenant colonel in the Corps of Engineers. I've built bridges under fire in Iraq, supervised controlled demolitions on 3 continents, and managed tunneling operations through geological formations that would make a mining engineer weep. For the last 14 years, I've been the division president of underground construction at Vance Heavy Civil, based out of Columbus, Ohio. In that time, I personally oversaw $6.8 billion in completed underground projects. 2 major highway tunnel bores, a freight rail bypass that cut through 600 feet of Devonian shale, and a municipal water main replacement during a crisis that was 48 hours from putting 2.3 million residents on a boil water advisory. That last one almost killed me. 19-hour days for 3 months straight. Living out of a job trailer on the east side of Columbus. Sleeping in 2-hour increments between pour cycles. Eating whatever the night foreman brought in, which was usually cold pizza from a gas station on Broad Street. The city council held emergency sessions. The governor's office called twice a week. The EPA sent inspectors every 72 hours. I held it together. Every connection, every valve, every foot of 36-inch main. I signed off on all of it. Not because I had to, because when you're replacing a water main that serves a metropolitan area, and the existing pipe is 104 years old and crumbling like chalk, you don't trust the paperwork. You trust the man standing in the trench. Carol understood that. My wife, Carol, understood all of it. She understood the deployments, the midnight phone calls, the missed dinners, the empty chair at Thanksgiving. She understood what it cost to be married to a man who measured his life in project milestones instead of anniversaries. During the water main emergency, she'd drive to the site gate every single night at 11. She'd hand me a green Coleman thermos she'd bought at the hardware store on Olentangy River Road the same week I started at Vance. The thermos had my dinner in it. Whatever she'd cooked. Soup, chili, sometimes just reheated pasta. She never stayed long. She'd hand it over, squeeze my arm. I say, "Come home when you can," and drive away. I still have that thermos. It's dented on the bottom, where I dropped it into a trench during a midnight inspection on week 9 of the water main project. The paint's worn off the handle. The lid doesn't seal right anymore. I use it every single morning. Cold water now. No lemon, no ice. Just cold water. A habit from my time in Iraq, where cold water was the only luxury that mattered. Carol died 2 years ago. Massive stroke. No warning. She was 53. I found her in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. The coffee maker was still running. I don't talk about it much. There's nothing to say that makes it smaller. She was the anchor during my darkest deployments, and she was the reason I came home to anything at all. After she passed, it was just me and Sarah. Sarah's 16 now, horror high school junior. She drives herself to practice for the competitive robotics team, where she's the lead programmer. She's smarter than I ever was, and she's got her mother's ability to look at a problem and see the solution before anyone else sees the problem. I missed a lot of her childhood for Vance Heavy Civil. Recitals, parent-teacher nights. The first day she drove a car by herself, I was underground on a bore alignment, and Dave Caldwell texted me a photo he'd taken from the parking lot because he knew I'd want to see it. Dave Caldwell is the general superintendent, 52 years old, worked the tunnels with me for a decade. The kind of man who can read the geology by the sound the cutter head makes. He's the one who sees what's happening in the dirt before anyone reads a report. If you've ever been called a name by someone who couldn't survive a single day doing your job, hit that like button and subscribe. Every day brings completely new stories, each one more intense than the last. Now, let me tell you about Blake Mohouse. Blake showed up 15 months ago. He was the nephew of Richard's wife. Not Richard's nephew, not of Vance by blood, but the nephew of the woman Richard married late in life. The man was 64. He built Vance Heavy Civil from a 2-truck grading outfit into one of the largest underground contractors east of the Mississippi. But he married late, and his new wife had opinions about who should be running things. Specifically, she had opinions about her nephew Blake. Blake came in with the title of Executive Vice President of Strategic Growth, 30 years old, Georgetown MBA. He'd spent his entire career, all 4 years of it, at a management consultancy in D.C., where his primary contribution, as far as I could determine, was making slide decks about operational efficiency for companies he'd never set foot inside. His first week at Vance, he held a company-wide meeting, stood up front in a slim-cut navy suit with a wireless clicker, projected a slide that said, Vance 2.0, an agile footprint for tomorrow. He talked for 45 minutes about synergistic alignment, lean transition frameworks, and what he called shedding legacy thinking to unlock scalable growth. Nobody in the room knew what he was talking about. These were men who'd spent their lives underground. They knew hydraulic pressures. They knew soil classifications. They knew which unions you called first and which inspectors you never surprised. Blake didn't know any of that, and he didn't want to learn. Over the next 15 months, I watched him chip away at the operation. He canceled the monthly safety stand-downs because they were non-revenue days. He replaced our fleet maintenance tracking system, which had worked perfectly for 9 years, with a cloud-based platform that crashed twice in its first week and couldn't interface with the GPS units on our boring machines. He fired the procurement manager, a woman named Ellen Whitfield, who'd been negotiating aggregate and steel prices since before Blake learned to drive, and replaced her with a 26-year-old from his consultancy network who didn't know the difference between Type 1 and Type 5 Portland cement. I went to Richard about it. 3 times. The first time, Richard said he'd talked to Blake. The second time, Richard said Blake was still finding his footing. The third time, Richard wouldn't take my call. That's when I understood. Richard wasn't running his company anymore. His wife was. And his wife wanted Blake at the wheel. So when Blake stood up in that Tuesday morning meeting and called me a ditch digger with a hard hat, when he announced in front of my entire division that he was restructuring underground operations and reassigning my active projects to a project manager named Tyler Prescott, a 31-year-old with a civil engineering degree and 0 underground experience. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. There was an HR coordinator in the back of the room, a young woman named Janet Ellis. She was gripping the edge of her clipboard with both hands and staring at the baseboard like she was trying to disappear through it. Blake slid a manila folder across the table. Severance terms, 60 days of salary, a non-disparagement clause, a handshake line about honoring my contributions. I looked at the folder. I looked at Blake. I looked at the 14 project managers sitting around that table. Men I'd trained, men I'd pulled out of flooded tunnels, men who knew what $6.8 billion in completed work actually looks like when it's covered in mud and sweat and sometimes blood. Then I picked up Carol's thermos, tucked the folder under my arm, and said 5 words. I understand. Good luck, Blake. And I walked out. I drove straight to the diner off I-71. It was 9:40 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the place was almost empty. In 2 truckers at the counter, A retired couple splitting a plate of eggs. ESPN on mute on the corner TV, showing highlights nobody was watching. The vinyl booth creaked when I slid in. It always does. The same crack runs along the left side of the seat. Been there for years, getting a little wider each time. Barb saw me come in. She didn't say anything. She just filled a glass with ice water and set it on the table as she passed. No lemon, no small talk. That's why I come here. I sat with both hands flat on the table for a while, looked at the parking lot through the window. Flat gray sky pressing down on everything. The kind of Ohio autumn sky that doesn't threaten rain. It just leans on you. My white 2011 Silverado 2500 HD was the only vehicle in the lot that had mud on it. 190,000 miles on the clock, and dried Ohio clay packed into the wheel wells like it had always been there. I wasn't angry. People think you're supposed to be angry when something like that happens. 25 years in the Army and 14 more in the dirt, and a 30-year-old who's never been underground decides to rewrite your value in a conference room. But anger is a luxury. I learned that a long time ago. In Fallujah, in the tunnels, in the months after Carol. Anger doesn't build anything. It doesn't solve anything. It just burns fuel you need for the work ahead. And I had work to do. I pulled out my phone and called Warren Mitchell. Warren and I go back 20 years. Former Army JAG officer who got out and became, in his own words, the most unpleasant commercial real estate attorney in Columbus, Ohio. He'd handled my personal property transactions for the last decade. He knew what I owned. He knew exactly what I was going to say before I said it. Morning, Mitch. Morning, it's time. Silence on his end. 2 seconds. Then, I'll have the notice drafted by end of business. Certified delivery. Process server. 90 days. Standard commercial lease termination. They won't be able to challenge it. Your LLC is clean, your title is clear, and their lease has been month to month since the original term expired 3 years ago. I know. Mitch. A pause. You sure? I'm sure. Then I'll file the eviction notice tomorrow morning. They'll have it by noon. I hung up, took a drink of water, watched a semi pull into the lot and idle there, in diesel heat shimmering off the stack. Let me explain what Warren was filing. 7 years ago, a commercial real estate parcel went up at a bankruptcy auction in Franklin County. 12 acres on the west side of Columbus. Flat, graded, with highway access and heavy utility infrastructure already stubbed in. Water, sewer, 3-phase power, the works. It was perfect for heavy civil staging. I knew because I'd helped survey the utility connections myself when Vance first leased it a decade before that. Nobody at Vance was paying attention to who owned the dirt under their feet. Why would they? The lease payments went out every month to a holding company, and nobody ever asked who was behind it. The rent was reasonable. The lights stayed on. The holding company was Sailor Holdings LLC. It was mine. I'd formed it with Warren's help using savings from my Army retirement and 14 years of living below my means. Carol and I never carried debt. We drove paid-off vehicles. We put money away. When the parcel hit auction, I was the only bidder who understood exactly what that piece of ground was worth. Not for what sat on top of it, but for what couldn't operate without it. That 12 acres held Vance Heavy Civil's headquarters building, their primary equipment yard, their maintenance bays, and the staging area where they stored and serviced tunnel boring machines that cost 8 figures apiece. Relocating that facility would take years. Building it out somewhere else, the grading alone, the utility work, the crane pads, the environmental permits, 3 years minimum. I knew because I'd been the one who built it out the first time. For 7 years, I collected rent and said nothing. It wasn't a scheme. It wasn't revenge. It was an investment. The kind a man makes when he understands that ground is the one thing nobody can take from you, and that people who live in buildings they don't own are always one signature away from standing in a parking lot. Now it was time for that signature. The next call I made was to Dave Caldwell. Dave picked up on the first ring. Mitch, I saw what happened. Where are you? The diner. You okay? I'm fine, Dave. I need you to listen. What's the status on the Scioto River Interceptor bore? Tyler Prescott's supposed to take over the technical review Friday. A city inspector's already scheduled. Who's the inspector? Ed Brennan. Ed Brennan, who pulled the stop work on the Olentangy project in 2019 because the previous contractor couldn't produce a qualified bore plan. That's the one. And Tyler Prescott has how many tunnel bores on his resume? Silence. Then, quiet. 0. Does Tyler know the city's surety bonds on those contracts require a licensed engineer of record with documented tunnel boring experience? Mitch, does he know those bonds name me specifically? That without my signature on the bore plan certification, the city's bonding company can void coverage on every active tunnel contract? Dave exhaled. A long, slow sound, like air leaving a tire. Nobody told him. Blake doesn't even know what a surety bond is. I know. Mitch, that's $1.3 billion in active municipal work. If the bond's void, the city has to halt every dig. Full stop. I know that too. I hung up. Finished my water. Left $3 on the table for Barb, even though she'd never charged me for water in 14 years. I drove home. I picked up Sarah from school at 3:15 because her robotics practice was canceled. Something about a parts shipment being delayed. She climbed into the Silverado, tossed her backpack on the floor, and looked at me. You're home early. I am. Everything okay? It will be. She nodded. Didn't push. She's like her mother that way. She reads the room and trusts you to fill in the details when you're ready. We drove home listening to nothing but the engine and the tires on wet pavement. I made spaghetti for dinner. Nothing special. Boiled water, jar sauce. Our garlic bread from the freezer. We sat at the kitchen table, and she told me about the robot her team was building. A 6-axis arm with machine vision that could sort recycled materials by polymer type. The classifier keeps misidentifying HDPE as LDPE, she said. I think the training set is too small. You'll figure it out. I know. It's just annoying. I watched her eat. I was present. Not checking my phone. Not running schedules in my head. Not wondering what was happening underground on a bore I couldn't see. Just sitting at my kitchen table with my daughter on a Tuesday night, eating spaghetti. It was the first dinner I hadn't rushed through in a very long time. 48 hours after I walked out of that Tuesday meeting, Warren's process server delivered a certified notice to vacate commercial premises to Vance Heavy Civil's registered agent at 11:47 a.m. on Thursday. The notice was issued by Sailor Holdings, LLC, legal owner of the 12-acre parcel at 4200 Westport Road, Columbus, Ohio. 90 days to vacate. Every structure, every piece of equipment, every vehicle, every boring machine, every tool and form and generator on that property. I wasn't there when it arrived, but Dave Caldwell was. Dave told me later that the notice sat on the front desk for almost an hour before anyone opened it. The office manager, Linda Brennan, no relation to the city inspector, finally opened it because it was marked certified, and she thought it might be a regulatory filing. She read the first paragraph. Then she read it again. Then she stood up and walked directly to Richard Vance's office. Dave said he heard her voice through the closed door. Mr. Vance, we need to call legal immediately. By that afternoon, the dominoes had already started falling in the dirt. Prescott walked into his first technical review on the Scioto River Interceptor bore at 2 p.m. Ed Brennan was waiting for him. The man had been a city tunneling inspector for 22 years and did not suffer fools. He asked Tyler 3 questions within the first 5 minutes. What was the overburden pressure at the planned depth of 47 feet? What spoil classification system was the bore plan using? And where was the signed engineer of record certification for the surety bond? Tyler couldn't answer any of them. Brennan pulled his stop work authority at 2:23 p.m. that same Thursday. And the bore, the largest of the active tunnel projects, went dark. Boring machines idled. Crews stood down. The city's bonding company was notified by close of business that the named engineer of record was no longer employed by the contractor. By Friday morning, the bonding company had issued formal notice on all 4 active municipal tunnel contracts. Void coverage pending certification of a replacement engineer of record who met the qualification requirements, which, for underground work at this scale in a metropolitan area, meant someone with a minimum of 15 years of tunnel boring experience and a professional engineering license with a geotechnical specialty. There were maybe 12 people in the state of Ohio who qualified. I was one of them. Prescott was not. Dave called me Friday evening. I was sitting on the couch reading while Sarah did homework at the kitchen table. "It's bad, Mitch." I figured. Blake held an emergency meeting this afternoon. He kept saying they'd find a replacement engineer. He said it was a personnel gap that could be solved with agile staffing. Nobody in the room could look at him. What about Richard? Richard sat in the back of the room and didn't say a word. His face was gray. I've never seen him look like that. And the eviction notice? Their attorney called your attorney. Warren told him the notice is valid. The lease is month to month. And the clock started Thursday. 90 days. Dave was quiet for a moment. Then, Blake still doesn't get it. He keeps talking about finding new staging facilities. I don't think he understands what it takes to relocate 3 tunnel boring machines, 140 pieces of heavy equipment, a full maintenance bay, and a fuel depot. He thinks it's like moving offices. He thinks a lot of things. Mitch, the delay costs on the Scioto project alone. I know the number, Dave. And I did. I'd run that calculation myself years ago during the original bid. A full project halt on a municipal tunnel bore of that diameter, with liquidated damages already written into the city contract, would cost Vance Heavy Civil approximately $240 million. And that was just one project. 4 contracts, all frozen. Every boring machine on that yard, the yard I owned, sitting idle while the clock ticked on a deadline that couldn't be negotiated. Blake Mohouse was now standing in a building that didn't belong to him, on dirt that didn't belong to him, running machines he didn't understand, holding contracts that required a man he'd just fired. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen. Richard Vance. The 4th call from that number since Thursday. I hadn't answered any of them. I set the phone face down on the cushion. Sarah looked up from the kitchen table. "You're not going to get that?" "No." She studied me for a second. Then she went back to her homework. The phone stopped buzzing. The house was quiet. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the scratch of Sarah's pencil on paper. I picked up Carol's thermos from the side table, took a drink of cold water, set it back down. The phone lit up again. And this time it was a number I didn't recognize. A 614 area code, probably their attorney trying from a different line. I reached over and turned the phone off. Click. The first call I took was on Friday morning. Not from Richard. Not from Blake. Not from their attorney. From Apex Underground and Tunneling. Their CEO, a man named Grant Holloway, had been trying to recruit me for 6 years. Every December, like clockwork, a lunch, a handshake, a standing offer. I'd always said no. Loyalty to Vance. Loyalty to what I'd built there. Loyalty to the memory of doing good work in a place where the work mattered. Grant didn't waste time. I heard what happened. News travels. "Mitch, I've got the offer letter sitting on my desk. Same one I update every year. Except this time I added an equity position. $38 million vesting over 4 years. Full operational authority over underground division. And Mitch, I want to lease that yard." I didn't answer right away. I looked out the kitchen window at the heavy autumn sky pressing down on the backyard, at the leaves plastered to the wet patio Carol used to sweep every morning before work. Send the letter. It's already in your email. Warren reviewed the terms that afternoon. Clean. Generous. No non-compete issues. Vance's severance package had included a non-disparagement clause, but no non-compete, because Blake Mohouse didn't know the difference between the two. I signed Monday morning at Warren's office. By Monday afternoon, Apex Underground and Tunneling had executed a long-term commercial lease on the 12-acre parcel at 4200 Westport Road, the same parcel Vance Heavy Civil had 90 days to vacate. The timing was precise, not cruel, just precise. The way you measure a bore alignment or set a grade stake. You don't rush it. You don't add flourish. You just put the instrument on the mark and read the number. The number was very clear. Blake found out about the Apex lease on a Thursday. Dave told me what happened. Blake was in the staging yard, the yard I owned, standing next to a Liebherr crawler crane that weighed 400,000 pounds and couldn't be moved without a month of logistics planning and 3 DOT permits. His chalk gray 2024 Porsche Macan sat parked at the yard entrance, pristine rims catching no light under the flat Ohio sky, looking like it had been dropped onto the gravel from another planet. He was wearing that pristine carbon fiber hard hat and those spotless Red Wing boots. My standing on gravel he didn't own, leaning against equipment he couldn't operate, holding a phone to his ear because for once the AirPods weren't enough. Dave said Blake's face went white. Not red, the way angry people get. White. The kind of white that means the blood has left, and it's not coming back. He hung up the phone and looked around the yard. Really looked at it, maybe for the first time. At the boring machines in their cradles. At the maintenance bay with its overhead cranes and welding stations. At the fuel depot, the aggregate bins, the rows of tunnel forms stacked on timber cribbing. At all of it, every square foot of infrastructure that represented a decade of build-out and couldn't be replicated in 90 days or 900. He just stood there, Dave said, while like a man who finally realized the floor was made of glass and somebody had just picked up a hammer. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't in a boardroom. It wasn't formal. There was no polished table, no lawyers flanking anyone, no frosted glass. It was in the staging yard. A Thursday afternoon, 11 days after I'd walked out of that project manager's meeting. The sky was the same flat, heavy gray it had been all autumn. Equipment sat idle everywhere. Boring machines cold, generators silent, crews reassigned to nothing because there was nothing to assign them to. Richard had called me that morning. I picked up this time. Mitch, I need to see you. I'll be at the yard at 3. I drove the Silverado through the front gate at 2:55. So it parked next to a lowboy trailer that still had a set of cutter discs strapped to it. Discs I'd ordered 4 months ago for the Scioto Interceptor, now sitting in weather they were never designed to sit in. $160,000 of tooling. Rusting. Richard was waiting by the equipment bay. He looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. Gray face, wrinkled shirt, no tie. His hands were in his pockets, and he was staring at the ground. Blake was standing 6 feet behind him, arms crossed, jaw set, trying to project authority in a space that had already rejected him. Dave was leaning against the bay door. He'd asked to be there. I told him fine. I got out of the truck, left the thermos on the seat, walked over. Richard spoke first. Mitch, I think we can work something out. I'm listening. We want you back. Full title restored. Salary increase. Blake will step back from underground operations entirely. You'll have full authority over. Richard. I said it quiet, not sharp, just final. The city has voided your surety bonds on every active municipal tunnel contract. Tyler Prescott's failed technical review has triggered liquidated damages on the Scioto Interceptor that your own bid documents estimate at $240 million. Your bonding company is reviewing whether to continue coverage on any Vance project statewide. And in 79 days, you need to move every piece of equipment in this yard, including 3 tunnel boring machines that can't travel on a public road without a 6-week permitting process, off my property. Richard opened his mouth, closed it. Your lease is month to month, has been for 3 years. Your attorney confirmed that with Warren Mitchell. The eviction notice is valid. The property belongs to my LLC, which I've owned for 7 years. And as of Monday, I signed a long-term lease on this parcel with Apex Underground and tunneling. Blake stepped forward. You can't. I already did. Blake's voice went tight. You planned this. You were sitting on this for years, waiting. I was sitting on an investment, a 12-acre parcel with highway access and heavy utility infrastructure. What happened to it after you fired me from the company I built? That was your decision, not mine. Blake looked at Richard. Richard didn't look back. Richard, I said, I spent 14 years in your dirt. I saved your company during the water main crisis. I trained every project manager in that building. I signed the bore plans that kept your bonds valid and your contracts alive. And your nephew-in-law called me a ditch digger in front of my own people. Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. I know. Then you know this is done. I turned and walked back to the Silverado. Dave Caldwell pushed off the bay door and followed me, not saying a word. Just walking. Behind us, I heard Blake say something to Richard. Something about lawyers, about injunctions, about fighting the lease termination. Richard's answer was 2 words. I heard them clearly across the gravel. Stop talking. The slow rot took exactly 14 days. Day 1 through 3, Vance's legal team filed an emergency motion to contest the eviction. Warren had it dismissed within 48 hours. The lease was month to month. The notice was properly served. The law was simple. Day 4, the City of Columbus formally suspended all 4 municipal tunnel contracts pending bond reinstatement. The city engineer, a man named Paul Stafford, issued a public statement. The projects would not resume until a qualified engineer of record was named and approved by the bonding company. The Columbus Dispatch ran it on the front page of the Metro section. Day 5, Blake attempted to hire a replacement engineer of record. He contacted 3 firms. All 3 declined. Not because they didn't have qualified people, because they'd already heard who was available, and 2 of them were already in conversations with Apex about subcontract work under my authority. Day 7, the bonding company pulled coverage on Vance Heavy Civil statewide. Not just the tunnel contracts, everything. General liability, performance bonds, bid bonds. A heavy civil contractor without bonding is a truck without an engine. You can sit in it, but you're not going anywhere. Day 9, the Ohio Department of Transportation opened a compliance review into the project delays. Blake's cancellation of the monthly safety stand-downs, the ones he'd called non-revenue days, surfaced during the review. 3 documented safety protocol violations in the last 11 months. OSHA was notified. Day 11, Richard called an emergency board meeting. Blake Mohouse was removed from his position as EVP of Strategic Growth by a vote of 4-1. The lone dissenting vote was Richard's wife. Richard himself voted to remove Blake. Dave told me Richard's hand was shaking when he raised it. Day 14. Blake Morehouse's LinkedIn profile quietly changed from EVP of Strategic Growth at Vance Heavy Civil to nothing. No new position. No open to work banner. Just a degree from a school that hadn't prepared him for any of this. And a gap that would follow him into every interview for the rest of his career. OSHA's investigation resulted in 3 formal citations and a $1.4 million fine. The Columbus City Council opened a public inquiry into the contract delays, naming Vance Heavy Civil specifically. Richard Vance hired a crisis management firm, but the damage was structural. Within 60 days, 2 of the 4 suspended municipal contracts were rebid. Apex won both. The other 2 remained in limbo, generating liquidated damages that were bleeding Vance at a rate that made the $240 million estimate look optimistic. Where Blake Mohouse never worked in heavy civil construction again. He took a position at a real estate development firm in Northern Virginia 8 months later. Mid-level, no direct reports. The hard hat, as far as I know, is still in a box somewhere. Richard Vance sold his majority stake in the company the following spring. The buyer was a private equity group from Chicago that immediately brought in new management. Dave Caldwell stayed on. I told him he should. The work still mattered, even if the name on the building changed. I started at Apex on a Monday. My office overlooked the yard at 4200 Westport Road. The same 12 acres I'd built out a decade ago. The same equipment bays. The same staging area. Except now the machines in the yard belonged to a company that wanted me there. Died. The $38 million equity position vested over 4 years. I didn't think about it much. The number was just a number. What mattered was the work. Boring machines turning, crews in the dirt, projects moving forward, cities getting the infrastructure they needed from people who understood what it meant to be 100 feet underground with 3,000 tons of earth above your head and no room for anyone who didn't know what they were doing. On a Saturday in late October, I drove to Sarah's school. State Robotics Regional Finals. A gymnasium with fluorescent lights and folding tables covered in laptops, wire bundles, and the mechanical arms and chassis of 30 competing robots. Parents filled the bleachers on both sides. The air smelled like hot solder and floor wax. I sat in the 3rd row. Carol's thermos was on the bench beside me, a dented bottom and worn handle and lid that didn't seal right. Cold water inside. I unscrewed the cap and took a drink and set it down and watched. Sarah's team was at their station on the far side of the floor. She was bent over a laptop, her fingers moving fast across the keyboard, adjusting something in the classifier code, the one that kept confusing HDPE and LDPE. She'd fixed it. I could tell by the way she straightened up and nodded once, the same way Carol used to nod when she'd solved something she'd been chewing on all day. The robot's arm moved, smooth, precise, sorting polymer samples into bins with mechanical certainty. The judges watched. Sarah's teammates watched. Sarah just stood with her arms crossed, reading the data on the screen, already looking for the next problem. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about bore alignments or surety bonds or lease terms. I didn't think about Blake Mohouse or Richard Vance or the building across town where my name used to be on a door. I sat in a gymnasium on a Saturday morning with a thermos my dead wife bought me at a hardware store on Olentangy River Road and watched my daughter do something extraordinary. And I was there, not on a job site, not underground, not answering a call from someone who needed me to hold their world together. Just there, in the bleachers, present. That was the thing I built that mattered most. They say the foundation is the part nobody sees. That's true. But here's what they don't tell you. The man who poured it always knows where the ground is, and the man standing on top of it usually doesn't. Not until it shifts. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and ring that notification bell to get alerts about new stories like this one. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.